We're in lesson number 8 tonight. So we'll start there in a few minutes. Okay, just so we go back through real quick, just to review, the idea is that we're building up our understanding of the Old Testament and really the whole story of the Bible. Before Abraham was, what do we see in that early lesson we looked at? Okay, what was the first thing in that section of Genesis? Creation. After that, sin, fall, man. Okay, and then after that we have Noah and the Great Flood, and we have the Tower of Babel and the tower that they built, and how that after that the people spread out. And then you have the patriarchs. You have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And they're the ones that God spoke directly to, the fathers of the families, spoke to each of them. And then Jacob's son, Joseph, was the one that was sold into slavery by his brothers, goes down to Egypt, works as a slave for a while, and then ends up in prison by being falsely accused. And then after that ends up being able, because he can interpret dreams, ends up being the leader of the Egyptians, second only to Pharaoh himself, leading the nation through 7 years of prosperity and then 7 years of famine. In the course of that, his family comes down a few years into that time of famine. They come down and they stay there. They settle in the land of Goshen, and they grow and they prosper and they become very large. So large, in fact, that the Egyptian Pharaoh later on was afraid of them and also recognized that they could be a great force. And so he didn't pay attention to or know the things that Joseph had done. And so they put him into captivity, made them slaves. Over about 400 years total, from the time Joseph was there until that they're slaves. Toward the end of that time, God raises up an individual, Moses, who was born of one of those slaves, but yet grew up in Pharaoh's house as a son of Pharaoh's daughter. Moses leads the Israelites out 40 years after that, because he had fled them and comes back after God calls him from a burning bush. And Moses leads them for about 40 years in the wilderness until he dies. He dies right before they go into the promised land. The one that takes over is Joshua. Joshua leads them in, divides up the promised land between the 12 tribes, and then it takes about 7 or so years for them to settle the land. And a short while after that, Joshua is gone. And the period that comes from then on, that 400 years, is the period of what? What's right after Joshua? Judges, okay? All the judges come through. The end of the judges, the last judge is Samuel. And Samuel, in addition to being a judge and a priest, ends up anointing the first 2 kings of Israel, Saul and then David. And Saul reigns 40 years, David reigns 40 years, and David's son, Solomon, reigns 40 years. And that's where we've come up to tonight. Tonight we're going to look at the divided kingdom. Solomon's son Jeroboam becomes king in his place. And the people approach Jeroboam. You see, Solomon built a lot of things, and Solomon was wealthy. But anytime a government gets wealthy, it's typically on the backs of taxpayers. They had taxed other nations, but also their own nation. And the people said, we need a break. Will you give us a break, lower our taxes basically, and we'll serve you? Well, he consulted 2 groups of people. He consulted the older ones, and what did they tell him? lighten their load, okay? He said if you do that, they say they're going to follow you. He also asked the younger men, his contemporaries, and what did they say? Yeah, just think of all the money we can make. Tax them more. And he says that my finger is going to be thicker than my father's waist. My father chastised you with whips. I'll chastise you with scorpions. What happened as a result? 10 of the tribes said, see ya. And they split, leaving Judah and Benjamin. Get this, folks. The United Kingdom split in two because of taxes. Okay? You realize how ironic that is? In looking at, and here we are in election year, and the huge disparity of opinion. I don't want to air those opinions. Not going to air my own opinion. But anybody with half a brain realizes there's a huge disparity of opinion between the Republican candidates and the Democratic candidates. They're on opposite, not even on the same page. And there is a great divide in our nation. And one of the biggest things that we're divided on is taxes. And that's all I want to say about that. But just noting that here it is that the nation of Israel split in, I wouldn't say in two, because a larger portion went one way and a smaller portion went the other. But basically it amounted to taxes. So we aren't the first people that dislike taxes and all that goes with them. Certainly those have been around for a good while. And they decided to split up. Well, it became a lot more important than just taxes. The reason being is because God had given to them the responsibility and the guidance to remember Him, and they were to do that, and they were to worship on certain times of the year, like the Day of Atonement and the Passover and other things. And they were to do that in Jerusalem at the temple. And that's where where their worship was centered. Their worship and their religion was geographically centered. Now you got to realize there's no way we could do such a thing today. And Christianity didn't do that. But Judaism, God required of them that they would go at certain times of the year to do that. Well, Jerusalem is in Judah. And so the other 10 tribes were now isolated because they were in another country. And Jeroboam, in the lesson, devises a plan. What was his plan that he devised? He becomes the first king of the northern kingdom of Israel. What does he do? They worshipped at a different month and day, and he gave them things to worship. He put a golden calf at Dan and one at Bethel. Dan is at the very southernmost point of the northern kingdom, and Bethel's at the very top. And so he made it more convenient that they don't have to go down there. Also, there was convenience in mind, but he was also a politician. And he realized that if his people went down to Jerusalem, they might just stay. And they might just decide to get back in line with Judea and rejoin. He was all in favor of the other tribes staying away. He liked the idea that they were in a civil war. And they did, of sorts, have a civil war. It was maybe not on the scale like of our Civil War or the French Revolution or some things like that have gone on, but it was skirmishing back and forth over the next several years. Those two nations did, and they did fight back and forth over territory and other things, but it all came down to the fact that they didn't want to pay the taxes that Rehoboam was going to bring, and they didn't want to follow after his leadership. And so the northern kingdom, immediately because of those golden calves, from day one becomes idolatrous. And so because from day one they became idolatrous, if there were any people that were righteous, if there were any people that were like, say, the Levites, they came and went down to Judah. They left to do that, but not many did. And so you have a situation where these people all of a sudden have, by their own choice, cut themselves off from God by doing that. And so in doing so, it is for that reason, when you look at the kings, the northern kings, the kings of Israel, not the kings of Judah, but the kings of Israel, were all a part of that idolatrous mechanism. They were all idolatrous kings. None of them were any good. The one that had hope for being possibly good was Jehu. God gave him the kingship. He's the one that Elisha anointed to go and kill Ahab. He had killed Ahab and Jezebel, and he was to be the king. And God gave him message by way of the prophets that if you follow me, I'll bless you. But he didn't do that. And so he was one that might have been a good king for a day or two. But really all of them were wicked. And it says of them that they all did evil in the eyes of the Lord. When you look at the pages 92 and 93, they have listed 4 sections of kings. And these kind of break up based on the time frame. If you've got a pen or a pencil, I'd like you to mark in there. Here's all of the northern kings were wicked. But here I want you to make a little star or asterisk or whatever you want to do to mark it. But on the southern kingdom of Judah side, put a mark next to Asa. Down in the second section, put a mark against Jehoshaphat. And then also at the bottom of that, Joash. And then when you come over to the third one over there, put a mark next to Amaziah, Uzziah, and Jotham. And then in section 4, put a mark against Hezekiah and one against Josiah. Now, anybody want to guess why I asked you to put a mark against those and to acknowledge them? Those are all the good kings. Those are all the good kings. And how you know that they're good kings, if you read any of the descriptions about them, it would say who they were, who their mother was, and then almost immediately the next statement was they did right in the eyes of the Lord. It would say they walked in their father David's steps, or they walked in their father as in their actual father, the king's steps, or they'll say that they followed in the kings of Israel's steps. That means that's not a good thing. And said that they would say that they did evil in the eyes of the Lord, or that they walked in somebody else's steps. And so you can see the influence of a legacy that the kings did, that some of them followed after David. Others followed after other kings that were wicked. And so as a result, it changes their result. When you notice this in the southern kingdom, and that's what we're going to look at the most, but real quick, the northern kingdom, of the northern kingdom's kings, the one you're really going to notice is Ahab. Of course, Ahab was the king that Elijah had all his run-ins with. The one that, he's the one that was the king when Elijah had the 3.5-year famine, which the drought that it wasn't raining, and he was married to Jezebel, and he was really a bad character, a real famous bad character. He's one of the reasons why you probably didn't consider naming your son Ahab, or anybody else for that matter. And his wife Jezebel, she kind of ruined that name too. You don't know many Jezebels or Ahabs for that reason. Those names are kind of ruined. And then also Jehu is the one that killed some of the others that were present, and he was kind of almost more like a judge, but he didn't turn out very well either. So that's the northern kingdoms. Of course, they're carried into captivity by Assyria. They're destroyed, and first off, and that's why there are no northern kings listed in the fourth section, which is the time period after they're taken into captivity. And really, all they were mostly an aggravation to the prophets that dealt with them. If you'll look at the handout I gave tonight, the handout tonight is primarily the prophets, but the prophets and the kings' time frame is the same. And so I went ahead and did this because this chart on the prophets is going to be relevant tonight with the kings. It's going to be relevant next week when we look at the exile and the post-exile, and it'll be relevant the week after that when we look at the prophets. But if you'll notice, Elijah and Elisha both prophesied to Israel. Hosea prophesied to Israel. Amos prophesied to Israel. And so, there were 4 prophets. And, of course, Elijah and Elisha didn't write, but they were very prominent in their work and their role in Israel. So God tried with Israel, okay? God tried turning them back. God tried to call them back, and it had very little success. Very little success in doing that. And so, because they had so fallen into idolatry, and primarily it was in worship of Baal. A lot of the other prophets prophesied to Judah and about Judah. So they were with them. So on to the southern kingdom side. There are quite a few good kings. Asa and Jehoshaphat were just what I guess I would describe as pretty good kings. Joash did better than they did. Amaziah and Uzziah and Jotham were yet again relatively good kings. Probably the 2 best kings of all the ones in Judah were the last 2 that were good, Hezekiah and Josiah. Hezekiah and Josiah, what they did more so than the other good kings, usually what it says about them, about Asa and Jehoshaphat and Joash, Amaziah, Uzziah, and Jotham. I think it says this about every one of them. If not, it says it all but one of them. But all of them failed in one area. And that was they left the high places, in which the high places are the places of worship, that they worship the idols. So they followed God, but they allowed other people in their nation to continue following idolatrous things. Got that? They themselves were good, but there were people in their nation that were idolaters. Hezekiah tore down those things, and Josiah went even further. Tore down all the idol things, and Josiah was the one where they were looking through the temple and happened to find an old copy of the law. And they pull the law out and they read it, and they read about the Passover, and Josiah has them hold a Passover unlike had been done in hundreds of years. They have a Passover very similar to the Passovers they had when they were in the wilderness wanderings and from before. So they went back, and Josiah brought the people back further than any of the rest of the kings of Judah. And yet his son and those that came after him, those last 4 kings, were really wicked. Manasseh was the most wicked of all the kings of the southern kingdom of Judah, which happened to be the son of Hezekiah. It proves that you can't please God based on your coattails. Hezekiah was probably the second best of all the kings outside of David. Was probably the second best, but had the worst son as a king in all of Judah. And then, of course, Josiah had Manasseh and Ammon as his father and grandfather, but yet he turns out really good. And so it's a great example of each person standing on their own 2 feet and doing their own things. And, not necessarily because one was righteous, that their son was righteous, and vice versa. And so that is the basic story of the kings. In pages 96 and 97, he talks a little bit about, or mostly about Elijah and Elisha, and about the fall of the southern kingdom on page 98, and the fall of the northern kingdom at the top of 98. And so those things took place. The northern kingdom is taken and kind of pulled apart, scattered, and essentially gets resettled, but in a sense kind of gets ethnically cleansed in a way. They're not able to continue being their own nationality of people. They end up intermarrying with other nations and essentially become another race of people, which by the time we come to the New Testament ends up being the Samaritans. The people that are the Samaritans and nobody likes in the New Testament are the remnants of the northern kingdom that is intermarried with other nations. And so they become a nation of their own. And so that kind of gives you the idea as to why the southern kingdom, the Judeans, did not like the Samaritans because of that. That they once were Israelites, but through various reasons ended up not being a part of the nation anymore. King Nebuchadnezzar is the one that destroys Judea and Jerusalem. He does it in 3 waves. The first time is when he really takes over the country, takes over Jerusalem and Judea. He puts up a king. They don't do so well, and he doesn't like what they do, and he gets rid of them. Jehoiakim is the one that he overtakes the first time. His son, Jehoiakim, is the one afterwards, because he doesn't do what Nebuchadnezzar wants. He knocks him out, and then Zedekiah, he doesn't do what he wants, and so he finally gets rid of him. And when he goes in with Zedekiah as king, he gets rid of the whole place. He pretty much tears it down. The temple is completely leveled, and everything is gone. Everything that made Judah is gone after the third deportation. In the first deportation, Daniel was taken into captivity, and the second one, Ezekiel. And then after the third one, there's just basically a few poor people there to man the vineyards and do a few things that they make it just kind of like a far out outpost that the Babylonians do. There really isn't anything left that you could call a nation. So, they have that. They're taken into captivity, and they're held in captivity for 70 years. And then they're allowed to come back. And they do that in a couple ways also. But they come back and restart the nation. And, in that restarting, you have the books that we're going to look at next week. Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. And so they take place during that time frame. So, any questions or comments on the lesson part of all this? There's 20 kings of each, I believe, and that's a lot of kings. And there's a lot of stories in there. I tell you, you open up 1st or 2nd Kings and you read a chapter and you find yourself reading 10 of them in a hurry, because it is all fascinating reading the stories of the kings and what they did how they didn't do what God wanted or did do what God wanted. And it's just really neat to see that. It sometimes is a little tough in the beginning part of it when you've got Judah and Israel, because it goes back and forth between those two nations. But you notice that Israel's the northern kingdom and Judah's the southern kingdom. And all the Israelite kings are evil. Now, all of them do wicked things. And only some of the southern kingdom. Any questions? All right, let's start. Mark?
One real quick parallel thing. The breaking away from England was just the opposite, in that the good people pulled from the evil people, not only for taxation but religious freedom, because they were under the Church of England, which had greatly departed from God's teaching. The remnant of the church was found back in England even during that period of time, and eventually was spawned over here by an ex-Baptist minister who came to see the light by studying the gospel on his own. But it was an interesting parallel that it's just the 180 degrees from what happened here, and God blessed this land for well over 200 years.
Yeah. Yeah, so they certainly had an interesting situation that when happened. And, the thing also, even though the northern kingdom of Israel did fall into idolatry pretty quickly, God still held out hope on them too. And there was hope for them up until the end. But yeah, it's interesting to see how our nation develops and how that compares and contrasts and all other things. So yeah, it's always a fascinating thing to look at it from those angles. Okay, the first section that we go through. Let's all do these together, and then I'll have the younger kids do the fill in the blank section after this. Babylon, which one is it? B. The nation that destroyed Judah in a series of 3 deportations. Number 2, the temple. J. A permanent center of worship built by Solomon. Before that was the tabernacle. Had the same function, but this was a permanent structure. Number 3, Elijah. H. Prophet of God who confronted Ahab. Okay. 4, Rehoboam. A was the son of Solomon, who ruled the southern kingdom of Judah. Now, I want to just real quick. One of the things about Solomon that Solomon's most famous for, Solomon wrote the book of Proverbs, didn't he? He wrote the book of Proverbs, and if you remember, the first several chapters of Proverbs is written. You remember what the perspective is? It's written from a father to a son. Remember that? About telling a son to avoid folly and avoid wickedness and all that. And so, one of the greatest pieces of literature, it's inspired by God, written by Solomon, about the way that you raise a son to be wise, and Rehoboam ends up being one of the biggest fools in all the Bible. A little ironic. Anyway, but that's Rehoboam. Makes one of the biggest mistakes in all of biblical history by not giving the people a break, and the nation splits over it. Okay, Dan and Bethel. G, they're the cities where Jeroboam placed golden calves that he made. Number 6, Baal. L, the false god that Ahab and Jezebel worshipped instead of God. Baal was the biggest, most prevalent god of the Canaanite peoples. Baal is going to be the one that we will come up with again and again. When you study that, it is Baal, and the female counterpart of Baal is Asherah or Ashtaroth. But Asherah is her name. Asherah was Jezebel's god. Ahab had Baal, Jezebel had Asherah, and so she had her own prophets of of Baal and Asherah. So Asherah, Ashtaroth is the female version of Baal, which ended up being much like the mythological gods that come along later in the Greeks. So 7, drought. D, 3.5 year period of time when it did not rain in Israel during the days of Ahab. 8, Assyria. I, the nation that destroyed Israel and threatened to destroy Judah. 9, Jeroboam. K, the first king of the northern kingdom of Israel. Number 10, Naaman. F, Assyrian military commander who was healed of leprosy by Elisha. All right, number 11, 70 years. C, the length of Judah's captivity. And then number 12, Elisha. E, the successor to Elijah. Even though Elijah and Elisha didn't write, there's a lot of things in there about them that, a lot of accounts from them that we find in 1st and 2nd Kings. All right, younger people will help me out on this especially. Before Elijah prepared sacrifice on Mount Carmel, what did he do to the altar of the Lord? Lacey? Okay, put the tribes around. Yeah, he prepared it. What did he do after that as well? Caden? Okay, he prayed for fire to destroy it. He built the altar, put 12 stones, he prayed for it. But what's the one thing he did in between? Caden again? Lacey?
Drenched it 3 times with water.
Yes, drenched it with water. So he built it, put the sacrifice on it, drenched it with water, and then prayed, and God sent fire down out of heaven to consume the sacrifice. Okay, number 2, the blank carried the northern kingdom. Stephen? Assyrians. Carried the northern kingdom of Israel into captivity. The Lacey? Babylonians carried the southern kingdom of Judah into captivity, yes. When Athaliah seized the throne of Judah, she attempted to secure it by doing what to her family? Stephen? Yeah, she tried to kill all her family. Not a very, very nice thing to do. That's why she wasn't supposed to be on the throne anyway. Number 4, there were 3 deportations to Babylon. The prophet blank was taken the first one. Caden? Daniel. And the prophet was taken in the second was Francie? Ezekiel. Okay. When Hezekiah received a letter from the king of Assyria, what did he do with it? Stephen?
Took it to the temple and spread it before the Lord.
Yeah, took it and showed it to God. I think that's really, really kind of neat. Like God, he took it to the temple and laid it out before God. And of course, you recognize that, God can see it wherever. But I think it's a pretty powerful gesture that he takes and he spreads it out before God. All right, everybody on multiple choice. 10 of the 12 tribes formed the northern kingdom of Israel, leaving only Judah and what other southern tribe? Benjamin. According to 2 Kings 17, 6-8, why did God allow Israel to be carried into captivity? D, idolatry. What false god did Ahab and Jezebel worship? A, Baal. Magog and Molech were other gods. Molech was the one that they offered human sacrifices to. That was of all of the gods that they worshipped in the Old Testament, that had to be the most detestable one, because that's the one that had the human sacrifices. Anyway, while the Lord immediately lit the altar for Elijah, when he asked, Baal never did for the prophets when they asked. Why not? Hey, he's not really a god, yes. How many prophets did Elijah kill after his victory on Carmel? 450. How long did the Babylonian captivity last? 70 years. What incurable disease did Elisha heal Naaman of? Leprosy. Okay, application questions. Why did Jeroboam change the time and location of the Feast of Tabernacles? Why not instead comply with the law of Moses and leave it in Jerusalem? More convenient? You know, I'd put he as a politician. You know, I mean, it's because he didn't want to lose his nation. Yeah, he knew they would go back to Jerusalem. So, you know, he was trying to keep his people there. All the motivations, all the reasons were wrong. Trying to keep them away from Jerusalem. And, you know, there's a great lesson of how bad it can be if we try to change things. You know, and that's the next question. Obviously, God was not pleased with Jeroboam's changes to Israel's worship. Is it possible we can displease God by changing the way we worship? Yes. You betcha, yeah. Abraham called him the troubler of Israel. 1 Kings 18:17. Was Elijah in some way to blame for the drought, since he was the one who prayed for it? No. He was only in the sense that he prayed for it, but it was the wickedness of Ahab and Jezebel and the people is the reason why I did it. And so he may have technically been the one praying for the drought, but it was not because he wanted it. It's because he needed to prove to them that Jehovah God was God. Last question. Why did the citizens of Judah refuse to believe the prophets that warned them of a possible Babylonian invasion, even after the northern kingdom of Israel was destroyed by Assyria? Lacey?
Because they believed God would not let them be taken.
They believed God would not let them be taken. You know what? They believed it'll never happen to us. That is the worst belief you can have. It'll never happen to me. Those are, I'm noticing, I'm just going to make an observation. Those that are older in the audience tend to more of them are having smiles on their faces because they know. A lot of the younger ones don't quite know what that means. But somebody's been around a little while, you know how important that is. The belief that it'll never happen to me is one of the worst things you can ever believe. Because that is wrong on all accounts. People believe that about the end of time. People believe that about our nation. We'll never fall whenever, whatever. You know, they believe that about all kinds of things. It'll never happen to me. You know, it's other people that die doing this or that. It's other people that have whatever happened to them and don't end up going to heaven. It's other people that do that. It's other people that it'll never happen to me. Well, I can tell you that's one of the worst things you could ever believe. Because look at it this way. If God's people could be destroyed and taken into captivity with individuals like Daniel and Ezekiel among them, and Isaiah and Jeremiah and some of these prophets that we have, if God could judge them and destroy their nation with people like that as citizens of the nation at the time it happens, it can happen to anybody. Thanks. We'll hit it. On the puzzle, he's not even here tonight. Ed's our puzzle. Make sure Ed gets one of the puzzles, Shane. Make sure he does. But Ed is our honorary king of Israel. Or he's a king of Judah, because there are no good kings of Israel. He's an honorary king of Judah tonight.